Nuclear revenge. My boss constantly humiliated me at meetings. I collected evidence of his fraud and handed it over to the tax office. He received a fine and a warning. My boss humiliated me in front of everyone, making me feel invisible, incompetent, and small, yet the fire it ignited in me was unstoppable. Every Monday, the meeting room felt like a battlefield where Mr. Hargrove, with his sharp tongue and smug smile, would twist my words, ridicule my work, and take credit for everything I achieved. No one defended me. My colleagues either looked away or smiled awkwardly, pretending not to notice the public shaming. It wasn't just the embarrassment. It was the injustice, the audacity of a man who built his reputation on manipulation and lies while I, diligent and honest, was blamed for his mistakes. The final straw came during a quarterly presentation when he accused me of fabricating numbers that were perfectly accurate. The red flush of humiliation crept up my neck as silence filled the room, and I realized that if justice was to be served, it would have to come from me. For a week, I studied him, watched his habits, his interactions with accounting, and discovered his hidden machinery of deceit. Fake expense reports, inflated bonuses, and manipulated financial statements designed to make him look indispensable. The more I learned, the calmer I became. This wasn't revenge born from rage. It was strategy, precision, and inevitability. I began collecting evidence meticulously, downloading confidential files when he wasn't watching, documenting every irregularity, every fraudulent number, every hidden transaction. His arrogance became my ally. He believed he was untouchable, and that hubris blinded him to the storm I was quietly assembling. I carefully built a timeline of his deceptions, cross-referencing dates, amounts, and signatures, crafting a case that would leave no room for denial. One evening, I overheard him bragging to a colleague about how clever he was in covering his tracks, and I smiled, knowing the trap was ready. I hinted in passing to another coworker that someone should review the latest tax reports, watching Hargrove's expression tighten with a flicker of suspicion, which only fueled my confidence. The weeks passed, each piece of evidence stacking higher, every forged signature and falsified number cataloged and ready to expose him. Then came the decisive moment. I delivered a carefully organized package of proof to the tax authorities, concise, undeniable, leaving no shadow of doubt. The next day, Hargrove's world began to crumble. The whispers started in the office, then the calls, the official notifications. He was fined, reprimanded, and stripped of the pretense of infallibility. Watching his face pale, the arrogance drained, replaced with shock and helplessness, I felt a satisfaction that words could never capture. The same man who thrived on humiliating others was now the one exposed, cornered, and powerless. Justice had been served, quietly yet devastatingly, and I walked past him in the hallway with a calm smile, the weight of my dignity restored. So tell me, would you have done the same? Would you have waited for the right moment, or acted in the heat of rage? Was it fair, or just inevitable? The day after I handed the evidence to the tax authorities, the office felt different, though I pretended nothing had changed. I could see it in his eyes, the flicker of panic, the rapid calculation of which exit was safest, which ally might betray him. He walked faster, muttering under his breath, pretending to concentrate on spreadsheets, but the aura of confidence that once cloaked him like armor had vanished. I watched quietly from my desk, sipping coffee as he approached me, forced smiles plastered on our faces, both knowing the invisible storm had begun. In meetings, his voice trembled ever so slightly, an unintentional reveal of his growing anxiety. I noticed the small details, the way he kept glancing at his phone, the way he double-checked numbers with trembling fingers, the way he avoided making eye contact when anyone mentioned deadlines or reports. His empire of deception, which had thrived in silence and fear, was crumbling brick by brick, and I felt no rush to celebrate. Patience, I reminded myself. The most satisfying revenge is not explosive. It is inevitable, slow, and unrelenting. I began documenting the aftermath as if recording a story for posterity. Every panicked meeting, every whispered conversation, Every stuttered excuse became a testament to the power of evidence and strategy over arrogance. I saw him cornered, pleading subtly to colleagues for help, but the subtlety was wasted. The co-workers who had once avoided my eyes now looked at him differently, some with silent amusement, some with cautious curiosity. He began to isolate himself, checking and rechecking his files, try to recreate a timeline, attempting to anticipate the next blow, unaware that the blows were already coming. The tax office's letters were precise, professional, leaving no room for argument, no shadow of doubt. I heard rumors circulating in hushed tones, the kind that spread like wildfire in an office desperate for gossip. He was being investigated not just for minor discrepancies, but for a web of manipulations that had stretched over years. It was more than a fine. It was a dismantling of the myth he had built around himself, a public unmasking that left him vulnerable and exposed. Every encounter became a silent theater. I would enter a room and feel the shift, the air thick with tension, knowing that he anticipated exposure at any moment. His once confident commands had transformed into hesitant suggestions. I watched as his attempts to regain control faltered. Emails he sent were scrutinized, phone calls he made were logged, and every defensive maneuver he tried only highlighted his vulnerability. It was an intricate dance of power, and I observed, careful to remain invisible, letting him stumble through the consequences of his own arrogance. I kept my reactions measured, a calm smile here, a polite nod there, letting him stew in the uncertainty of his unraveling. Then came the first direct confrontation. He stormed into my office, slamming the door in a theatrical display of anger, accusing me quietly but sharply of orchestrating his downfall. I looked up, pretending mild surprise, letting the silence stretch between us. I allowed a brief, ironic smile to cross my face, the tiniest acknowledgement of the truth that he could neither confirm nor deny. His words were venomous but uncoordinated, a desperate attempt to intimidate me. But the evidence was already in the hands of people far more powerful than either of us. I remained calm, letting his frustration build, knowing it fed the narrative of his own undoing. The more he tried to assert dominance, the smaller he appeared. Every accusation he made bounced back on him like echoes in an empty hall. Within days, the official notice arrived, a substantial fine, a formal warning, and a detailed report outlining his fraudulent activities. The HR department began to question past approvals. The accounting team quietly reviewed every document he had touched, and whispers of potential legal consequences circulated in the office. Hargrove's usual bravado had vanished, replaced with a careful, calculated panic. He attempted to repair his image, offering feeble apologies and explanations, but the credibility he once wielded like a weapon had been irreparably damaged. I could almost feel the weight lifting from the office, a collective exhale from colleagues who had endured his tyranny for years. It was not revenge born of rage. It was precision, patience, and timing. Watching him unravel was strangely poetic. The same man who took pleasure in crushing others' confidence now felt the very thing he had inflicted on me. And yet, there was a deeper satisfaction in knowing that it was not personal cruelty, but justice itself that had delivered the blow. The quiet triumph was infinitely more powerful than any public confrontation could have been. I walked past his office the day the notice was formally delivered, catching the flicker of recognition in his eyes, a realization that he had underestimated me, underestimated the inevitability of truth. I smiled subtly, a small, knowing gesture, and returned to my work. The office atmosphere shifted subtly afterward. Colleagues no longer flinched at his presence, and I could sense a new respect forming, unspoken but unmistakable. As the days passed, the aftermath continued to unfold in ways I had anticipated but could not entirely control. Hargrove became a shadow of his former self, careful, guarded, and increasingly isolated. Yet, for me, the most important part was not his humiliation, but the restoration of balance, the knowledge that fairness, meticulously executed, could outmaneuver arrogance. The story of his downfall became a silent warning, a lesson etched into the walls of the office for anyone who might consider exploiting others in the future. It was not a victory announced with fanfare. It was a quiet, unstoppable tide that reshaped the power dynamics, leaving me in a position of calm authority and restored dignity. And as I reflect on it now, I wonder how many people endure the daily cruelty of someone like Hargrove, waiting for a chance to strike back, unsure if justice will ever arrive? Would you have the patience, the precision, and the restraint to orchestrate such a flawless reckoning? Could you wait for inevitability, or would you let anger dictate your actions? And in the end, when justice comes quietly but decisively, do you savor the triumph, or simply move on, carrying the knowledge that you have righted a wrong, unseen but undeniable? Days turned into weeks, and the tension in the office became almost tangible. Mr. Hargrove, once the untouchable tyrant of our department, moved through the hallways like a man walking on cracked ice, careful with every step, every word, every glance. I observed him quietly, noting how paranoia had replaced arrogance, how caution had replaced bravado. He'd double-checked reports 3 times before sending them, asked timidly for confirmations he would have previously dismissed, and avoided the very meetings where he had once lorded over everyone. The air of superiority that had made him untouchable now seemed like a distant memory, almost a cruel joke he played on himself. My colleagues, too, began to change. The ones who had cowered, pretending not to notice his cruelty, now walked taller, spoke louder, and occasionally exchanged knowing glances with me. There was a subtle camaraderie forming, unspoken but powerful, a shared recognition that justice, long delayed, had finally arrived. But I knew that patience, while satisfying, was not enough. I wanted the final act to be unforgettable, to leave a mark so indelible that Hargrove could never reclaim his throne of illusion. I began to set the stage meticulously. Every document, every piece of evidence, every subtle inconsistency I had uncovered was arranged in a way that would maximize the shock when the moment came. I crafted emails that appeared casual but contained carefully highlighted errors, small enough to seem trivial at first glance, but significant when pieced together. I ensured that the tax authorities' attention would be drawn precisely where it mattered, leaving Hargrove with no room to maneuver, no hidden corners to escape scrutiny. This wasn't impulsive revenge. It was a symphony, every note calculated, every pause deliberate, every crescendo inevitable. Then, I watched him unravel in small, delicious increments. He began questioning himself, wondering who might have tipped off the authorities, whether the discrepancies were truly random or targeted. His nights became restless. I overheard him muttering to his spouse about audits and penalties, about integrity and trust, about how no one would believe him if he denied wrongdoing. His confidence, once absolute, was now replaced by a gnawing uncertainty that he could not shake. And I stayed calm, quiet, almost invisible, letting the storm build around him while I remained a shadow in the background, the architect of inevitability. The office, meanwhile, had become a stage for subtle drama. Colleagues whispered, glanced, and occasionally smiled when he passed, small signs of the shifting power dynamic that made the unfolding scenario even sweeter. Hargrove tried to assert control, sending urgent messages, calling meetings, attempting to re-establish authority. But every action he took only highlighted his growing desperation. I could almost feel the universe aligning with my plan, the invisible hands of fate moving in perfect harmony with my careful orchestration. I had become a conductor, and he, the unwitting soloist in a performance that would end with his humiliation and my quiet triumph. One afternoon, the final trigger was set. I sent a carefully worded summary of the most blatant irregularities to the tax office, a document that left no ambiguity, no room for excuses. It was concise, irrefutable, and devastatingly precise. The correspondence was professional, almost clinical, yet the consequences it would unleash were dramatic and absolute. I watched from my desk as Hargrove received the news. The final assessment, the formal notice, The confirmation that every scheme he had used to manipulate numbers, cover his tracks, and maintain an illusion of perfection had been exposed. The color drained from his face, his hands trembled slightly as he read the official letters, and for the first time, he looked utterly powerless. I could not suppress a small smile. It wasn't gloating. It was the quiet satisfaction of inevitability fulfilled. The man who had once thrived on intimidation, on cruelty, on manipulation, was now the subject of whispers, speculation, and official investigation. His empire of lies was dismantled piece by piece, and the very colleagues he had sought to dominate now regarded him with a mixture of pity and incredulity. Hargrove tried to defend himself, to rationalize, to explain, but every word fell flat. The evidence was too overwhelming, the timing too perfect, the exposure too complete. He realized, too late, that he had been outmaneuvered not by luck, not by chance, but by strategy, patience, and meticulous attention to detail. As I walked past his office that evening, the final act of my plan silently playing out, I saw him sitting there, slumped, staring at his computer screen, the weight of his downfall pressing on him like a physical force. I didn't gloat, I didn't rub it in. Instead, I allowed a subtle acknowledgement, a slight nod, almost imperceptible, a quiet recognition that the game had ended and the victor was evident. The office felt lighter, freer, as if the oppressive atmosphere that had once defined it had lifted. Colleagues who had previously flinched at his commands now looked around, exchanged cautious smiles, and, for the first time, spoke without fear of repercussion. And yet, even in the midst of this quiet victory, I knew the story wasn't truly over. Justice had been served, but the reverberations would continue. Hargrove would have to navigate the consequences, face inquiries, perhaps even legal repercussions. The office had shifted permanently, and I had become a subtle but undeniable presence, a reminder that arrogance and cruelty have limits, and that patience combined with precision can outmaneuver even the most powerful predator. And so, as I returned to my desk, the hum of computers and the soft murmur of colleagues around me, I reflected on the journey, the meticulous planning, the careful observation, the patient orchestration, and the inevitable execution. I wondered, as I often do, what would have happened if I had acted impulsively, if I had sought revenge through anger rather than strategy. Would the outcome have been the same, or would I have merely satisfied a fleeting emotional urge, leaving the deeper triumph unclaimed? Could anyone truly appreciate the subtle, almost invisible power of patient justice, or is it only in hindsight that the elegance of such a plan becomes clear? And I turn the question to you. How far would you go to ensure justice? Would you wait, observe, and orchestrate, or act immediately and risk losing control? And in the end, when the moment comes and justice strikes quietly yet devastatingly, do you savor it in silence, or do you announce it to the world? The day of reckoning finally arrived, though, to the casual observer, nothing seemed different. The office hummed with its usual monotony, keyboards clicking, phones ringing, and the faint scent of coffee lingering in the air. But beneath that ordinary exterior, the tension was palpable. Mr. Hargrove, who had once ruled with an unchallenged sense of superiority, moved through the office like a man walking through a minefield, each step careful, calculated, haunted by the invisible weight of exposure. Every glance from a colleague, every hushed conversation in the hallways, seemed magnified in his mind, as if the walls themselves whispered of the truth he had spent years concealing. I observed him quietly from my desk, letting him stew in the anticipation, knowing that the final act of this drama was about to unfold. I had orchestrated everything with precision. Every email, every file, every document pointing to his manipulations had been positioned to maximize the impact. The tax authorities had already responded, sending official confirmations and notices, but I knew the true power lay in the office's own reaction. The final act would not be public humiliation in a boardroom or a formal reprimand. It would be the slow, exquisite unraveling of his carefully constructed illusion of infallibility, witnessed by those who had long endured his tyranny. I watched as he opened his inbox, the first notification arriving just as he tried to compose himself for a routine meeting. His fingers trembled slightly over the keyboard, a subtle betrayal of the panic coursing through him. The notice was formal, precise, and utterly damning, listing every fraudulent transaction, every manipulated report, every instance of deceit with clear documentation. The words were clinical, devoid of malice, yet their impact was catastrophic. Hargrove's face paled, his eyes widening as the reality hit him. He muttered under his breath, a barely audible string of denials and rationalizations, but the evidence spoke louder than any protestation could. Colleagues began to notice the change, glancing in his direction with subtle curiosity, some with thinly veiled amusement. The man who had once dominated the room with confidence and intimidation now fumbled through explanations, grasping for credibility that no longer existed. Each attempt to assert control, each forced smile, each defensive statement only highlighted his vulnerability, magnifying the satisfaction that had been building quietly within me. I allowed myself a small, controlled smile, letting the satisfaction simmer rather than explode. The power of patient, calculated revenge is in its inevitability. The real thrill lies in knowing that the outcome cannot be avoided, that every step has been choreographed to perfection. The office atmosphere shifted perceptibly. Meetings became tense, casual conversations filled with undercurrents of speculation. Hargrove tried to regain control, organizing impromptu discussions, attempting to clarify discrepancies, but his efforts were futile. Every question asked by colleagues, every glance exchanged, seemed to undermine him further. The narrative of his invincibility, the facade he had maintained for years, crumbled in slow motion. And then came the decisive moment. During a weekly meeting, he presented what he thought was a minor clarification, expecting colleagues to nod in agreement and move on. Instead, a quiet voice, one of the previously intimidated team members, asked pointedly about a specific discrepancy outlined in the official notice. The room went still. Hargrove's response faltered. He searched for words, for excuses, for something to regain the narrative, but the evidence was unassailable, the timeline airtight, the betrayal undeniable. The silence stretched unbearably, the kind of silence that presses down on a room, heavy and suffocating. And in that silence, the true climax of the revenge played out. I could see the realization dawn in his eyes, a sudden, painful recognition that he had underestimated me, that the careful orchestration he thought invisible had been executed flawlessly. His mouth opened, closed, opened again, words failing him as colleagues stared, some incredulous, some quietly triumphant. The entire facade of power, of intimidation, of untouchable authority was gone in an instant, replaced by shock, fear, and helplessness. I watched as the office absorbed the scene. The subtle nods, the barely suppressed smiles, the realization that the man who had dominated them for years was now exposed, vulnerable, defeated. There was no dramatic shout, no confrontation. The brilliance of the moment lay in its inevitability, in the precision with which every element had fallen into place, in the quiet perfection of justice delivered. And then, the aftermath began to unfold. HR began to review past approvals. The accounting team meticulously went through every report he had signed, and whispers of potential legal consequences began to circulate. Hargrove's attempts to explain himself became increasingly desperate, each word a futile attempt to stitch together credibility from a fabric long torn apart. His arrogance had been his greatest weapon, and now it was his most obvious flaw. The office, once tense under his oppressive shadow, began to breathe more freely. Colleagues exchanged subtle glances, a silent acknowledgement of the restoration of balance, the triumph of patience, intelligence, and careful strategy over cruelty and deceit. I remained calm, almost invisible, the architect of this perfect reckoning, letting the consequences unfold exactly as planned. In that moment, I understood the full weight of what had been achieved. The humiliation he had inflicted upon me, the fear he had sown, the arrogance he had wielded like a weapon, all of it had been returned to him, magnified by strategy, by patience, and by the inevitability of justice. Watching him unravel in real time, experiencing the slow, deliberate collapse of his power, was a satisfaction that no impulsive act of revenge could ever match. It was not cruelty, it was balance. It was inevitability made manifest. And as I left the office that evening, catching a fleeting glance of him slumped over his desk, staring blankly at the correspondence that had ended his reign, I allowed myself the quietest, most controlled acknowledgement of triumph. And now I turn the question to you. If given the chance, would you orchestrate revenge with patience and precision, or would you act in the heat of emotion? Would you wait for inevitability, or would you risk losing control? And when justice finally lands, subtle, devastating, and unavoidable, would you savor it in silence or announce it to the world? The weeks that followed felt almost surreal, as if the office itself was adjusting to a new reality. Mr. Hargrove, once the towering figure whose presence commanded fear, now moved like a shadow, diminished, tentative, a man forever changed by the inevitable consequences of his own actions. He attempted to navigate the aftermath with cautious precision, but every step he took only underscored his vulnerability. Emails were drafted and redrafted, explanations rehearsed and abandoned, apologies muttered under his breath. None of it carried weight, for the foundation of his authority had been quietly and irrevocably dismantled. What fascinated me most was how quickly the subtle equilibrium of power shifted. Colleagues who had once hidden in the corners, who had endured his tyranny in silence, now spoke with confidence, exchanged knowing glances, and even smiled when his name was mentioned. The oppressive tension that had defined the office for years had lifted, replaced with an almost tangible sense of liberation. And yet, the most important part of the victory lay not in the office's atmosphere, but in the undeniable proof of justice, executed with precision, strategy, and patience. I continued to observe quietly, the architect of this perfect reckoning, allowing events to unfold naturally. Hargrove's attempts to regain even a semblance of control were futile. Each request for clarification, each meeting he organized, each hurried phone call he made only revealed how deeply he had underestimated the reach of evidence and the inevitability of consequences. His hands trembled slightly when handling documents, a subtle but telling sign of his internal turmoil, while colleagues who had once cowered now conducted themselves with poise and quiet authority. There was a strange poetry in the scene. The same man who had thrived on intimidation and manipulation now floundered under the weight of facts meticulously arranged, while those he had oppressed silently reclaimed their space. The elegance of this transformation, the slow but unstoppable unraveling of his constructed world, was infinitely more satisfying than any immediate, emotionally driven confrontation could have been. And then came the subtle but unforgettable moment of finality. During a routine meeting, Hargrove attempted to present what he hoped would be a minor clarification on recent reports, expecting compliance, nods, and silent agreement. Instead, one of the previously intimidated team members, armed with a simple question about a detail from the official notice, shattered his carefully maintained illusion. The room froze, the tension almost palpable. His words faltered, his explanations stumbled, and for the first time, he truly understood the extent of his exposure. Colleagues exchanged glances, whispers barely contained, as the realization settled that the man who had dominated them for years was now thoroughly, undeniably powerless. The precision of my plan, the inevitability of justice, had reached its apex. There was no dramatic confrontation, no shouting, no spectacle, just the quiet, crushing weight of truth executed flawlessly. Watching him struggle to salvage credibility was a satisfaction so complete almost felt unreal. Hargrove retreated further into himself in the following days. Meetings were avoided, calls were deferred, and casual office interactions became strained and awkward. HR meticulously reviewed every approval he had signed. The accounting team scrutinized each transaction he had touched, and whispers of potential legal consequences circulated steadily. I observed each step without intervention, letting the ripple effect unfold naturally. The man who had once inflicted humiliation upon me now experienced it indirectly through the relentless, unyielding tide of consequences. There was no vengeance in my actions, only the patient, strategic orchestration of fairness, the deliberate exposure of truth, and the quiet restoration of balance. I began to notice subtle changes not just in him, but in everyone around him. Colleagues who had once walked on eggshells now carried themselves with confidence, engaged openly in discussions, and no longer flinched at directives. The office atmosphere had shifted permanently. Fear had been replaced with cautious optimism, tension with a subtle camaraderie. And through it all, I remained calm, a quiet observer of the inevitability I had set in motion. The satisfaction lay not in spectacle, but in the enduring realization that justice, carefully executed, leaves a lasting imprint far beyond the initial moment of reckoning. Looking back on the entire journey, I realized that the power of patient, meticulous revenge was not just in the act itself, but in the orchestration, the observation, the planning, the deliberate timing, and the understanding of human behavior. Every small step, every calculated pause, every subtle manipulation of perception contributed to a crescendo that was both inevitable and profoundly satisfying. The man who had humiliated me, who had built his success on lies and intimidation, was finally exposed, and the office itself had healed, rediscovering a sense of equilibrium and respect. And yet, even in this triumph, questions linger. Could I have acted differently? Could the same justice have been delivered with more immediacy, more confrontation, more spectacle? Or is the true power of revenge found only in patience, precision, and inevitability? I leave that to reflection, as the lessons are both personal and universal. And now, I turn to you, watching this story unfold. If faced with the same situation, would you have waited for the perfect moment, orchestrated justice with patience, or acted immediately, driven by emotion? Would your satisfaction come from immediate confrontation, or from the quiet inevitability of a carefully executed plan? And finally, was the outcome fair, or simply the natural consequence of arrogance and deceit?